Hello, I'm Maria Marquis with Coda, and today we're getting an inside look at how Figma ships product. We'll be talking to Yuhki Yamashita, VP of Product, Kris Rasmussen, VP of Engineering, and Product Manager Kelsey Whelan, and learn how they design their internal processes to create a culture of reflection and maintain focus and speed.
But let's travel back in time. So before this doc existed, I'd love to know a little bit about what was the process like before? What were those Google Sheets looking like, or how did you all work together?
When I started, we were actually just using paper, like Dropbox paper to do this. And so we just had kind of a tabular format, and we would kind of copy and paste it each time we had a meeting. But the paper docs got pretty slow over time, and it became pretty brutal to update it. So we moved to aggregating information from Asana into a Google Sheet so that it was easy to share. And that's when Yuhki joined and whipped us into shape.
So enter Yuhki. Yuhki, when you joined Figma, how many people were on the combined product engineering team?
I think the entire company was around 90 at the time, and I would say probably product design engineering was around 40 or so.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And Kris had set up a lot of really great structure. There was a weekly meeting. People took it seriously, which is hard to do sometimes. There was a fancy script that admittedly I didn't really understand, but definitely did some magic to bring Asana kind of objects into a Google Sheet. There's some niceness to Asana being the source of truth and Google Sheets reflecting that. But it was quite a bit more oriented towards the people actually doing the work. Engineers, for example, there was an opportunity to, consolidate that and make sure that people don't have to update, two different areas, basically.
For sure, yeah.
There's also one time, I think, where Kris went on vacation, and I think he's still kind of called in to run the script or something like that.
No.
And yeah, I felt pretty badly about that as well.
That's actually a really good segue into the doc itself. So Yuhki, let's start off with the first part of the doc, which is for the meeting where people are flagging what needs to be talked about. Can you, as the doc builder, talk about how you thought about building that section, like the purpose it needed to serve for the team?
I think Shashir showed me how he was trying to kind of create a way to dynamically create meeting agendas. By having people in the room add stuff and upvote, and you just kind of that becomes your agenda, the most popular items first. So that was the source of inspiration in terms of, this idea that we could dynamically select some items to talk about. Before, everyone was giving updates, and not all updates were equal. Some were kind of things that everyone already kind of knew about, and some were just kind of it was, celebrating a win that a team had, which is really important to talk about and to acknowledge. But if every single team ends up doing that, it takes up a lot of time. So the first thing was just creating a way to flag the things that actually warrant discussion, and that's kind of why I called it discuss or question, because it suggested that there needed to be a dialogue about it. And then, and it was almost kind of even the emoji was to emulate this idea that someone actively wants to ask a question about it. But I think some of the things we found over time was that wasn't quite enough, because we were missing the other aspect of people wanting to celebrate or give love to, wins and launches and things like that, where you don't technically have a question about it, but nonetheless, you want to take a moment with the room. And so that's what kind of quickly motivated this other button, which is the like or heart button, just so that people could show and express that feeling. And even as the person on the team, you could kind of feel good about that. So there's a separation of concerns for those two actions.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was we were able to get through the meeting more quickly because we were able to focus on the things that were important to discuss. The meeting time went down, and the relevance of discussions went up.
One thing I really appreciated about how this is put together is you have last week update and then this week's update right there next to each other too. Because I always find when I'm in a meeting, I'm like, wait, what did we talk about last week? I totally forget, because time just moves so quickly. We're at a really fast pace. So being able to very quickly enter in, know what happened last week, and what's going on this week just immediately grounds me into everything else.
This week thing was an aspiration around helping people remember, obviously, but also building some lightweight accountability. So for example, what I've often seen is something launches, and then in last week's update, you might have said, "Oh, metrics are coming. We'll report out on how it did." And I see a bunch of teams doing that and following up on that, and it's just kind of like a good reminder to have that kind of action item right there for you. Or similarly, if you were intending to send out a doc or a product requirements doc, that you can kind of like hold yourself accountable in that way.
Kelsey, for you, as far as as a product manager, what does this give you, kind of from your experience? So you're one of the people who's bringing those updates, bringing the status, communicating what your team is doing, communicating the wins. So can you walk through kind of how this section impacts your work and how you use it?
Yeah, so the doc is, like I mentioned, really helpful to see what everybody else is working on, and vice versa. If I post or if I share an update about something I'm working on, it's also helpful because other people are able to say, hey, did you think about it from this perspective? Or I have this feedback that I want to share with you. Or they can ask clarifying questions about like, oh, did you think about how that's going to work in embeds or something? So that's really helpful. I'd also say that just process-wise, it's really helpful to have a forcing function to actually, my engineering manager and I set aside an hour every week, and usually it actually only takes like 10 to 15 minutes to do all of our updates. And then we usually spend the rest of the time triaging bugs together, which is a good time spent as well. But it's a really good forcing function to make sure that we're on the same page and kind of share information about any updates that have happened the past week. So that's super helpful as well.
Yeah, love it. Yuhki, do you want to actually share the doc and we can just take a closer look at that section?
Sure.
And in looking at this particular section, I'd be interested to know from the group, is there anything about this that feels particularly Figma, like how Figma really thinks about how you all work together?
I guess not every organization plans out launch calendars as often as we do. And I think that's something that's pretty unique to Figma. We really try to coordinate tightly with other functions to make sure that we're launching things appropriately. And so that was, as I mentioned, one of the bigger pain points of the older process, because we didn't have the calendar view. So that feels pretty unique. And then also, the hearts in particular, I think are something that are, somewhat unique to Figma, in that we really try to provide opportunities to celebrate things and call attention to things that are going well.
I love that. Awesome. So the other question I have before we jump into the launch calendar is, you all start this meeting with 10 minutes of silent reading. Is that correct? And was that always the way that you did something? You always had silent reading before you went in, or was that something that came into play with this new structure?
It definitely came into play with this structure because I think the whole point was that there's a moment when we choose which topics to actually talk about. And prior to that, none of us knew what we're going to be updated on. And so we had to go around the table essentially to give those updates. But to give people the time to vote, to like, that was the intent of those 10 minutes.
Yeah, got it. Cool. Awesome. Well, let's go to the launch calendar tab, since this seemed to be kind of the next phase of the doc, right? Like, okay, we've got our meeting figured out, but now how do we start to work with the rest of our organization and communicate that out? So Kris, what did working with marketing and the launch, you mentioned that working really tightly on a launch is critical for how Figma ships their product and how they do business. So what did that look like before, as far as working with the go-to-market team?
Yeah, well, back when I was running this meeting, the go-to-market team was much smaller, so it wasn't nearly as complicated to orchestrate as it is today. Typically, it was the head of that team basically sitting in on this meeting and asking a lot of questions along the way, and trying to reconcile her launch calendar with the estimated ship dates from the engineering team.
So can you walk us through kind of the idea behind how you put this tab together, this particular page?
Yeah, I think the hard part is actually more about kind of how to create a process that ensures that people are keeping these up to date. Part of this was making sure that people take these dates seriously. And so, whether that's kind of like being able to see a quick view of this month or the next 2 weeks and what's launching, and kind of ask the question, does this look right? So that people are updating it then and there. Or, it's the launch date is one of the columns that's exposed here. And so, as it's kind of coming up, or I think I even had some conditional formatting where, if it was on in engineering, but, there was no launch date, or likewise, if we were kind of past the launch date, and, the stage wasn't updated, like there are ways to kind of create some cues to motivate people to keep it as up to date as possible. So that was the thing that I first thought about, because once you have the data in there, there's so many options for how to show it.
Yeah, for sure.
So those are the things that I thought most about. And then, the calendar view is really nice. As Kris mentioned, it is a big part of, Figma for us to be obviously working closely with the rest of the company for these launches, because they're truly cross-functional, but also to have this like clip of feature development and, this velocity of getting stuff out there that customers really love. So this view is helpful in seeing kind of like, hey, maybe we have too many launches this day. We need to like bundle it together into something more impactful. Or likewise, the next month doesn't look as strong, like let's talk about it. And so I think that was kind of, the motivation behind having kind of an overview.
Everything Yuhki said, I agree with. It's just a really helpful view to see what our team is launching on the prototyping side, as well as everybody else. One example that came up recently was our PMM asked to move we were originally going to launch a feature on a Tuesday, and he actually wanted to bundle it with something that we knew we were going to launch on Thursday. And I think this view is really helpful for him to see, hey, it's in a different space, but we're going to launch two things together. So things like that have shuffled even in the short time that I've been using it. And so it's really helpful for me to see kind of bird's eye view and plan for some of the bigger releases that are coming in the future.
Yeah, right on. Yuhki, can you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind including the launch "How did it do" column in this area?
Yeah, I think this was a later development where, as the doc as it stood was very much focused on ongoing work leading up to launch, and then once it was launched, it kind of like fell off the doc, if you will. And it didn't give us an opportunity to ask questions around how it did. And we wanted to make sure that we had that culture of reflecting back, looking at our data, and talking to our users to understand if these projects were successful or not. And so that was the motivation of just doing a simple view that shows what launched recently. I think we chose like a window like 2 weeks or a month or something like that. And in having this kind of empty cell here, people felt compelled to, document if, based on what data we're seeing, or often our support team would also populate this with issues that they're hearing about. So it's a really good opportunity to just not move on from the launch. And so that was kind of a cultural thing that I think is really important.
Yeah, well, and with the velocity that all of you have as far as shipping very frequently, many, not only features, but updates, and really just the movement of the team, it would seem like it might be easy to sort of forget all of the amazing stuff that's happened already, just because you're moving at such a fast clip. So as far as then the engineering team, Kris, having this launch calendar, how does the engineering team use this particular area? How does it impact your work?
As a team, we're really focused on like the next milestone for a large project rather than all the milestones. But we try to do our best to estimate when these launch dates will be. And then as we get closer to launch, we push harder to kind of hold them steady. And so having this in one place, I think, has actually helped us in the sense that rather than making the dates like more more solidified, it's actually given us a little bit of flexibility because the PMM
cool.
team can trust that it's being kept up to date. And so
Mhm.
there's fewer surprises, due to like later communication and things like that might happen
Yeah.
if it wasn't as easy to stay on the same page.
And I would assume that now you don't have to worry about kind of the product marketing team coming in and like checking, hey, is this going to happen? Is this going to happen? You just point them here and they trust that this is a snapshot of your brain and they can just kind of work with this. I would assume that would be the case.
I think so. Yeah. People don't
Yeah.
come to me as often, but there's also other people in the company. We have a great product team now. So I'm not sure if Yuki and his team are getting those same questions that I used to get.
Awesome. So Yuki, what other parts of this doc do you think are kind of critical for folks to know about as far as how it's put together or the thinking behind it? Is there anything else that we're missing here?
I think maybe some of the team pages. So this is a simplified view, and in practice, people have a little bit more of a complex setup. But
Sure.
basically, the nice thing about Coda is that you can build multiple views on the same thing. And oftentimes, the view that you're showing for consumption isn't the same view that you're using for editing. And, for example, here this might be the place where the collaboration team might specify who's working on these projects, or open this up a little bit more and add things like the PRD that Kelsey mentioned and other kinds of metadata. And the team can choose to group this in whatever way they choose. So in this case, this is just basically showing projects that are active and upcoming based on stage. Here too, this is where the team can brainstorm kind of ideas for what's upcoming, which isn't exposed in the active projects list. And at some point, the stage kind of flips from early thinking to planning, when it becomes more real, so to speak, and it gets elevated up here. So I think there's a little bit of management that on a per team level is happening, that kind of feeds into this. And one of the things we've been doing is also just asking asking teams to do planning, quarterly planning here as well. And so, some of the things that, for example, Kelsey might do on the prototyping team is add a bunch of prospective projects here, maybe create kind of like some new columns that indicate, your aspirations of what you want to do that quarter for that project. It gives you a space to kind of brainstorm a little bit before they get formalized as active projects. And this too is, I think, one of the big changes from before where, I think Kris and I kind of share this belief that there's two levels of planning. There's two levels of project management. There's planning and then there's executing. And, prior to this, it was mostly focused on executing and in Asana having tasks and milestones and things like that. But, when you're planning at the beginning of the quarter, you're thinking about big chunks of work, that are pretty high level, and you're trying to kind of like prioritize a bunch of these things. And so having a space to do it, and then having a space where, that can naturally just come into the roadmap versus copy pasting it over from somewhere else, like a doc, was another advantage of this structure.
Yeah. And Kelsey, since we're on a team page here, have you made any changes or customizations to your team page as far as the way that you like to use it to organize your thoughts?
Yeah, I've played around with showing and hiding columns or customizing when you open a row, what that view looks like on this page, and then kind of a bunch of other Coda documents that I've been working through. So it's been, and even just creating different categorizations. So another one, in addition to like what we're thinking about, you could have a whole section that says things that we are explicitly not doing and have kind of a justification to why you're not doing it. So I like that it keeps everyone on the same kind of high level guardrails, but then within each view, you can have the flexibility to still approach it in the way that makes the most sense for your team.
Yeah, I love that. And that actually brings up a good question around kind of defining it, and then everybody has the same understanding of it. Could you, Yuki, maybe talk through the stage, how you've defined them? I'd be interested to know if these were definitions that have always been part of how Figma classifies work, or if this is something that kind of came in as you were building it, Yuki.
It definitely kind of evolved
Mhm.
because I think, for me, I first had this more simplistic understanding of like, I don't know, not started product thinking, design, engineering,
Mhm.
launch or something like that. Um, but then we realized there's a lot more nuance. So, for example, there is a difference between kind of early thinking, which is you are spending some time on it, but you're not, it's
Mhm.
very still exploratory,
Mhm.
um, and versus planning where you've decided it's a thing and you're trying to make it happen. So I
Mhm.
think that distinction was something that came to be with Coda. We can, you can kind of like hover over it and it'll describe kind of where what
Mhm.
it is. And in fact, it's probably somewhere here. Um, yeah, some subtleties like we had some beta testing externally, and so it was interesting to kind of like note that.
Mhm.
There are points where the design wasn't finished and the engineering finished, but something needed to happen for it to move to the next stage.
Yeah.
This is a later one, completed and analyzed, which is differentiated from launched, where again to kind of like prevent things from falling out of view. So we let something fall out of view when it was completed and analyzed versus just launched, for example.
Yeah. I love that. That it's like a more of a commitment, not just it's out in the world, but we actually know the impact that it's had, and we can have that be in our launch reflection too. So let's think a little bit about kind of the biggest learnings that you as a team have had. So if you could go back and do it again, is there anything that you would do differently, Yuki, as far as building this doc out?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's still
All
things
of
that
them.
we want to do. Like, there's not every project is the same. And we have
Hmm.
some really large projects that should be kind of more, uh, that have like more granular milestones or
Yeah.
significant milestones. And how might we expose that within here? And
Hmm.
I think it's possible with the structure, it just needs a little bit more finessing.
Yeah.
Um, or Kris can maybe speak more about this, but one of the things that we're trying to be better about in general is PRDs, engineering docs, and just
Hmm.
kind of documentation. So how do we give more exposure to those kinds of things?
Hmm.
Like, right, this is like a good foundational kind of database to keep those things organized. But what we really want is more activity around those docs, people
Yeah.
reviewing them and seeing when things are changed. So those are things that we're beginning to think about. So it's really more kind of not something we do differently necessarily, but
Hmm.
necessary evolutions, I guess,
Yeah.
as we're getting bigger and more people are involved.
Totally. And Kris, what would you like to add to the doc as it grows? What would be your magic wand? Ooh, I'm going to add this to it.
Yeah, actually, I've been adding a lot of things to the doc. I think
Ooh, very cool.
since Yuki shared it publicly. But
Yeah.
they're actually in a separate doc that we linked to during the meeting.
Hmm.
So one thing we want to like get more visibility into is how we're doing against our quality KPIs.
Very cool.
And so we have sort of a companion doc to Yuki's doc that focuses in on how we're doing against like bug triage and
Hmm.
SLAs around time to fix bugs, and getting better perspective on where bugs are coming up, sort of
Hmm.
as part of a retrospective around future launches and things like that, and looking for ways to do better. So
Yeah.
we have a whole nother doc that provides scorecards and drill
Love
down
it.
things like that around quality that we also use now. Uh,
Yeah. Cool.
yeah. The other thing Yuki mentioned was just driving more visibility around docs of all kinds.
Hmm.
So we have PRDs which are getting created, but oftentimes missed, especially by
Yeah.
those of us who just aren't really looking for them every single second of every single
Totally.
day. And so we're trying to figure out ways to kind of highlight key changes to docs that are happening outside of Coda and inside of Coda.
Hmm.
Um, so that the team has one place to kind of find those, and we can kind of remind people to check in on that week over week so that they know
Yeah.
what's happening.
Cool. And Kelsey, what would you like to add to this doc? Ooh, what would be the next phase of development for you? Kind of the next bit.
I don't know if I have anything in mind that I would change to this specific doc, but I've been inspired by using the doc and
Hmm.
thinking about how we could apply similar structure to different areas. So
Yeah.
how can we partner with the support team to kind of categorize our
Hmm.
tickets coming in for feature requests? How
Ooh,
can
yeah.
we kind of have a kind of wiki-like hub that links out to different resources for someone joining our team? And I think
Mm.
there's a lot that you could do. Kind of learning all the features that Yuki used got me pretty excited to think about kind of how we could use that as this kind of like power ups in different areas.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's close out our chat today with advice that you would give other people who are starting to embark on, making their own doc that's similar to this process, or maybe using the template and kind of going in that, making it their own. So Yuhki, let's start with you as our doc maker. What advice would you give to folks trying to start a similar process in their own organization using a doc, or starting off with a template?
Sure, yeah. So I have this belief that process is really also a product of its own, and you really need to think through the end-to-end user experience, because sometimes you can create process that no one really wants to follow because there aren't enough incentives in there, or it's just this annoyance that doesn't fit into their workflow. So that would be my number one advice around, making sure that, for example, even if you make the doc, actually just as important is, having that meeting that, for example, in my case, Kris had already set up, but where there's a convention in the company to come around and, and give each other updates, right? And, even when it's designing the doc itself, figuring out ways that, where there's enough kind of benefit and value and reason to keep these updated, because none of this works if, people aren't updating it. So I think there's a lot of power within Coda to create incentives to do that. But that's something that, I wouldn't forget about. And it's not just as easy as taking this template and running with it.
I would say look at some of these docs that people put together and just try to kind of learn how they built it. And then you'll get inspired by seeing like, oh, you can write a script that does this, or you can create a button that opens up a form and adds a new row. Or I think the like feature, like tons of people could benefit from some feature like that. So I think if you just go through Coda and kind of reverse engineer some of them, I think inspiration will probably strike.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of echo what was already said, I think it's really important when you're rolling out process not to just copy what worked at another company or what worked at a previous company, and instead just listen to your team and try to figure out what are the pain points that they're feeling right now, and start by just solving those, rather than trying to roll out a comprehensive process for a much larger company than you currently have. So I'd say like use these docs as inspiration, but don't just copy them and try to make them work as is. And then I guess one Coda tip I have is just that I realize Coda is pretty powerful, and there's a lot of ways to remove kind of redundancy and repetitive work when building these docs. And so, make good use of hidden fields on your database models so that you don't have to copy and paste quite as much with custom formulas.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I guess we can close out for today, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
All right.